Here we go. I see the names popping up now.
Welcome, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to what is our last virtual training with Ryan and Khalil of Heartset. I told them that I am sad today because they have just become such a big part of my uh, midweek routine, and I just enjoyed being part of these sessions. I've learned a lot and just appreciate these two friends so much. And so I'm not going to waste any more of their time grieving here. I will just turn it over to them and let them do their thing.
Thanks so much, Laura. Yeah, we're excited to be back here for this final session. Apologies for letting the room open a little late. Yeah, we were spending a little time kind of ritualistically grieving and sharing a moment together, but here we are. And we're going to spend a little time today wrapping up this three-part series on vicarious trauma. I just have appreciated the chance to share info about this topic and to hear from you. And we're going to do a little bit more of that today. So we have focused quite a bit on what is vicarious trauma? How do we define it? What does it look like in our lives? And I'm excited to be able to dive into how do we manage vicarious trauma? How do we continue living knowing that living and working in the ways that feel right, knowing that um, we're probably going to be dealing with vicarious trauma at some point? So this is exciting for us. Um, Let me dive into it. Our typical shared expectations is mostly just around the fact that we want to hear from you. We love seeing your comments in the chat. We love when you kind of get us off track, actually, because it means you're thinking about things critically and it's causing you to think of new ideas. And I think we all just learn so much from that. So, just encouraging you, inviting you to share what you're thinking about. Ask your questions as we go. Don't hold your questions to the end. Um, and offer some dissenting opinions. Share what feels right. It is a tight hour and a half, and so we'll try to make sure we get through all of our content as well as some kind of engagement exercises that we hope will bring some of these concepts home for you. And then finally, we're going to share a link to our session evaluation at the end of the session. If you haven't filled out a session evaluation in these several months, if you've been with us all along, would love if you fill out one of them and give us your overall feedback of either this specific training session or what you've thought about any of the parts of the series. And you'll get a certificate of attendance in return for that. You can also look forward to receiving a copy of the slides and some additional learning materials over email once we wrap up this whole series. So look out for that in your inbox. Alrighty. Here are our learning objectives. By the end of this session, this hour and a half long session, we have 3 learning objectives. We want you to be able to list the ABCs of managing vicarious trauma. That's an acronym. It stands for 3 different components of our approach to managing vicarious trauma. So we'll go over that. We also want you to be able to differentiate between proactive and responsive strategies for dealing with vicarious trauma, understanding that we're in it for the long haul, right? This is a long game, and we need to be addressing what's happening for us now, as well as the potential for what could happen to us or happen alongside us and our clients in the long term. And then lastly, we want you to be able to identify at least 2 specific strategies to implement in your own life and in your own work for managing vicarious trauma. We're not out here saying you have vicarious trauma and so use this strategy to deal with it right now. We are saying the potential for vicarious trauma is quite high, is an occupational hazard in our work, and the strategies we'll use are quite individualized, right? It's gonna need to be responsive to your own life and your own work and your own attitude toward the work. And so we hope we'll offer some ideas that you'll be able to pinch something off of that feels right for you today. Yeah, I'm going to jump right into the review. So we've gone on at length in the last 2 sessions about empathy, the value of empathy, how we exercise empathy, and also that empathy is going to be the kind of key factor that leads to us experiencing vicarious trauma. So here's a quote from Judith Pearson, who is a psychologist and educator out of Southern Oregon University. And Judith says, "That which makes us good at and committed to this work is also what makes it challenging." It's the thing that kind of leads to us experiencing challenges and heaviness with the work, right? So probably if you're a helper and you're out there in the audience today, there's somebody in your life telling you, you're a really good listener. You have such good empathy, or maybe that's a skill you've honed over the years. That's what draws us to the work. That's what allows us to be good at the work. And that is what opens a vulnerability to the experience of vicarious trauma. So empathy has pros and cons for us. We talked, especially last session, about the ability to recognize and identify specific signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma. We talked a little bit about these 3 ways that we can understand what's happening for us in terms of symptoms. We may start new activities, new relationships with substances, start new ways of fuzzing out on our phones and on screens, start eating in different ways, right? We may stop doing certain things. We may stop showing up at family functions and social gatherings. We may stop being at work on time. We may stop exercising our exercise patterns that have been so helpful to us, right? And then finally, we'll experience different feelings than the ones we're used to. Increased agitation and anxiety, chief among them. So we went through a whole list of things that might start, stop, or feel as we're noticing vicarious trauma in our lives. And then we also talked about the way that perhaps we have an ethical obligation to pay closer attention to what's happening to us through vicarious trauma. We know that it's going to have a significant impact on our mental health, right, over the long term. We talked about the ways that it kind of mirrors PTSD in acute phases, but even maybe major depression and social isolation in later phases of vicarious trauma. We also know that it's going to impact our clients. We talked about the way that trust and healthy relationships are at the center, are at the core of kind of work towards healing and wholeness with our clients, right? And so when we're not able to show up, having dealt with our vicarious trauma, that's going to have an impact on our clients. And we also saw that we're more likely to leave our jobs, which means higher worker turnover in our profession, which means that the folks that we work with are going to get less experienced, less settled workers and helpers alongside them in their work role. And then finally, we talked about the kind of deep roots that mistrust of the system exists for folks living on the margins or folks experiencing marginalized identities. And so when we show up through the lens of trauma, unaddressed, unmitigated, we're contributing to that mistrust of the system and contributing to a broken system overall. So we think that there is this ethical obligation to do this work and to do it carefully. And you'll hear us talk about this a lot, but do it with intention. So that's our quick and dirty overview of kind of what led us to this 3rd and final session today. And I want to start today's session with a little bit of kind of a positive reframe of a lot of the negative stuff that we've talked about so far. And so I want to present to you first this concept of post-traumatic growth. Very different from, or kind of an inverse of the trauma that people experience, whether us in our personal lives or the secondary trauma in our work. So I'll put a quick definition here on the screen. It's that positive psychological change experienced as a result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances, right? So we struggle with something challenging, intense level of stress, maybe something rising to the level of trauma, and we may come out the other end of that with some positive psychological effects, right? Doesn't seem, we know very clearly that there's negative psychological effects of trauma, but sometimes there are positive effects. And so kind of what is that? And this concept of post-traumatic growth really began to be studied formally in the 90s. So it doesn't feel like that long ago. And yeah, just the basic idea that adversity can actually lead to positive personal growth and change. It usually shows up kind of in five domains. There are five domains of post-traumatic growth. The first of which is an appreciation of life, right? Folks who experience post-traumatic growth, that's usually associated with a heightened sense of gratitude for life itself. Okay? And I think we could even turn towards, well, how do I get towards post-traumatic growth? And having a gratitude practice or set of ritual may be one kind of aspect of that. So folks that are able to find joy in simple pleasures and develop a deeper appreciation for each day are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. We also see a domain of relationship with others, right? We know that trauma can lead to impacted relationships in the negative sense, but it can also lead to stronger and more meaningful connection with others, right? Where people who are survivors of trauma may experience increased empathy or compassion or a desire to help others who face similar challenges. This is quite common in the helping profession. You're probably familiar with folks who with lived experience, right, of homelessness, of substance use, of mental health challenges. Maybe they take on a peer role, peer specialist role, or recovery specialist role, or maybe that leads to folks going back to school and getting a graduate degree in social work or whatever, as a result of their own experience of trauma, right? It increases their empathy and compassion. It makes more meaningful their relationships with other people. The third domain is new possibilities in life, right? So folks sometimes discover new opportunities or pathways in their life that hadn't existed before experiencing a certain trauma. Um, I'm thinking of a person that I know that lost a job, and that opened pathways for them to kind of living their life in different ways, right? Maybe moving away from the 9 to 5 experience and taking advantage of that increased time to live a little closer to their values, right? So these new pathways that open up after the experience of trauma. The fourth domain would be personal strength, right? And so kind of developing this newfound sense of strength and resilience is one aspect of post-traumatic growth that can show up where people feel more capable of handling life's challenges and adversities, right? And so they become more settled in dealing with future adversities because they know they can handle it. They've experienced the growth, they've experienced what it means to be resilient, and they can carry that with them into the future. And then finally, there does tend to be with post-traumatic growth a spiritual or an existential change, right? Where people begin to explore and deepen their spiritual beliefs, which leads to greater sense of meaning and purpose. And we talked about the ways that vicarious trauma impacts our sense of meaning, impacts our sense of purpose. And so as people begin to dig deeper into their spirituality and what meaning exists in their life, it leads to that growth, right? That post-traumatic growth. There are like a number of key factors in the process of moving from kind of a more disordered relationship to trauma toward like post-traumatic growth. And one kind of important component of this that I want to highlight, and it's going to be a theme of our session today, is that as people are processing their trauma, thinking about it, experiencing kind of the after effects of trauma, it may lead to us kind of revising our beliefs about ourselves, right, and others and the world. And it can lead to, if we're careful and intentional, um, more adaptive ideas about traumatic experience, right? So we're kind of integrating these new insights about ourselves and about our trauma into our daily lives that can lead to positive changes in a whole number of things in our lives, right? Our behavior, our relationships, our overall well-being. Importantly, though, I want to say that um, schema change, that narrative development about that narration in our heads about the trauma, it is an intentional process. If we let it sort of carry us um, without putting a level of intention and integrating new insights into our lives, it is less likely to lead to post-traumatic growth. Okay, so that's the concept of post-traumatic growth. Oh, I'm seeing a comment in the chat that says, I just heard a woman speaking about post-traumatic growth the other day, and it hit me. I love the reframing of my personal historical trauma has become a source of growth. This is such a huge and important perspective to make folks aware of. Finding the meaning for the madness, as Kristen calls it, paved the way to lessening the pain of the current day. It shaped, not ruined you. Absolutely. And I love the way you kind of put that, Kristen, because it is all about a reframe. It's not that your trauma didn't exist, or it's not that it hasn't affected you in negative ways, because post-traumatic growth can occur alongside trauma, right? Or alongside vicarious trauma. But it's about how we frame it, how we think about it. There's this like really heavy cognitive component of post-traumatic growth. And of course, I'll make the pitch here that that's going to be made so much more easy if we're working alongside a therapist or at minimum social supports, right? So the disclosure of the trauma and reframing cognitively occurs best in partnership with other folks. So kind of just want to put that pitch out there. Great. The other concept I want to talk about is vicarious resilience, slightly different than post-traumatic growth. In the same way that secondary traumatic stress is akin to PTSD and is the inverse of post-traumatic growth, vicarious resilience is the inverse of post-traumatic stress. So let me give you a quick definition here. Transformations in the inner experience resulting from empathic engagement with the client's trauma material. Now, if I were to put up, I should have put this up on the screen also, but that is almost the exact same definition of vicarious trauma. It's a transformation in the inner experience. In this case, though, the pathway is resilience rather than trauma. So this term was proposed back in 2007, so it's not that old of a term even. And the work kind of came out of qualitative work with psychotherapists who are working with survivors of political violence. And the therapists were affected by their clients' stories of resilience, right? So people came in, talked in therapy about the way that they have moved through this political violence, and kidnapping was another example. And the therapists were really moved by that, right? And so we can see this parallel with vicarious trauma. It's the similar relationship dynamics that are happening where we're engaging our empathy, but in a more positive way, right? And so what's happening is we're drawing inspiration and strength from working with people. And sometimes when we know that process is happening, when we can sort of look at our clients and identify them as heroes, so-called, right? They're such a hero, maybe you might say to yourself, for making it through this trauma, and they're still standing, and they're still so kind, and they're still so compassionate, and all of these like sort of positive qualities about our clients. That's heroic and inspirational, right? And so when I can sort of identify that heroicism and inspiration that I can see in my client, that can fill me up and give me a sense that what I'm doing is right, and maybe I too have that level of resilience in my life, right? Sort of this idea that we're able to learn about coping, maybe not specific coping strategies, but learning how to cope in a broad sense with adversity from our clients. And so I love this idea because Khalil and I often talk about kind of removing ourselves from these positions of power, taking off our expert hats and just existing in relationship with our clients. And here we see an example of learning from our clients. Learning about how to cope with adversity can fill us up to work with more people who are coping with adversity, right? And we learn that directly from our clients. So I appreciate that mutuality. And then to kind of continue with the theme of intentionality, it is possible to strengthen those effects of inspiration and adapting to adversity through putting our conscious attention on some specific empowering elements, right? We're able to reassess the significance of our own problems. I say, you know what? This problem that I've been stressing over so much, maybe it's not that bad. I see this adversity that this client is going through. I'm looking at my own life. I know I can cope with this because they're coping with something really big, right? The incorporation of spirituality is another element that we can strengthen. Developing a sense of hope and commitment to the work. What else do I want to say here? We can develop a greater tolerance to frustration, right? Our frustration tolerance can increase through this process. And then lastly, we learn to use ourselves, right? This is a very therapist clinical lens, but developing the use of self in a therapeutic relationship. How do I exist in this space? How does my countertransference and transference lead to new learning, new coping, better understanding relationship dynamics? All of that strengthens the possibility for vicarious resilience. So post-traumatic growth, vicarious resilience, I think these are concepts that can serve as endpoints, right? For the work that we're going to talk about a little bit for the rest of the training. We're going to use our strategies in service towards moving towards some of these endpoints, understanding it's never a solid endpoint, right? It's always in process. It's always moving. It's a never-ending thing. I'm seeing Laura mention that it's also a way to take some control back from events that took away that control. I really appreciate that concept or that idea because one of the ways that we've talked about trauma is it's a loss of control, right? And so that post-traumatic growth process that we can move through intentionally is a way to have control and to mitigate the effects of that trauma directly. So let's talk a little bit about how do we manage our vicarious trauma, or how do we get towards vicarious resilience? Just reminding you that the way vicarious trauma affects us is it kind of hits us in these three very specific ways. The signature effects of vicarious trauma are it disrupts our integration of ourself. It disrupts our relationship to ourself. It disrupts our relationships to other people. And it disrupts our sense of meaning to the work, to our broader sense of life. And so any strategy that we use has to target those three effects, right? And so if you dig into the vicarious resilience or vicarious trauma literature, we talk about rebuilding the foundation through the ABCs. The A stands for awareness, right? Being attuned to our own needs, our own limits, kind of our emotional state and what emotional resources we have available to us. Paying attention to various sources of information in that awareness, right? Our cognitive info, what is our brain telling us? What are we intuiting? What is our body telling us from a somatic point of view? Practicing mindfulness and acceptance of who we are, where we are at this moment, and just allowing that acceptance to drive our awareness. Oh, I see another comment in the chat. It says, I was on both sides of the coin when I became an informal counselor for FEMA folks who spent their days listening to COVID bereavement stories such as theirs. Since I'm a bereavement professional and I've written books about funerals, I was able to listen to them when they called and to help them set appropriate boundaries between their professional and personal identities. Wow. I really love that because it's so directly about trauma, right? In the most disaster sense. And you were able to kind of use your own experience to help people set those boundaries appropriately, right? I love that, RC. Yeah, that's really cool. And I think that actually your comment actually speaks to the B in the ABCs, which is balance, right? Being able to maintain a balance between our various activities, between our work, our play, our rest. Having a sense of inner balance can allow us to put attention towards all aspects. There's a holism here, right? But part of that, maintaining that balance is, as RC says, appropriate boundaries, right? I do have to shut off work sometimes so that I can play. And I do have to sort of set aside play sometimes so that I can rest, and vice versa, right? And so one critical component of maintaining balance is maintaining appropriate boundaries, which is hard. I think most of us helpers are not very good at that, right? It's not something that comes naturally. I think we have to sort of develop that skill set. The final component of the ABC's acronym is connection. And it's connection with all aspects, right? Connection with ourselves, understanding who I am at this moment, especially as we age, right? As we kind of take new eras of our life. I just turned 40 recently, and it's really feeling like a new era. I don't feel like such a young spring chicken anymore, right? And so, kind of understanding that relationship with myself as it evolves, as it shifts, as my practice and my work shifts is really important. And communication, of course, is critical to the process of connection, breaking the silence of unacknowledged pain. So many times I've seen where folks finally come out and say, you know what? I am hurting right now. I've been trying to kind of put it off or put on a happy face or pretend like it doesn't exist until it goes away. But disclosing previously unacknowledged pain is a critical component to redeveloping connection with others and with ourselves. And all of that is going to offset the isolation that vicarious trauma can lead to. It can increase our sense of validation and increase our hope. So those are the ABCs of managing vicarious trauma. And in the remaining portion of the training, we're going to talk about some more concrete strategies that I think really do fit into those ABCs. Okay, I have been talking for so long. Let me kick it over to Khalil to talk about this next component here.
What we know about Ryan is that they have a really good podcasting voice, right? So folks love to hear you talk long. An important distinction to make when we're thinking about how we are addressing vicarious trauma, because we're at that point now where we're thinking, we know what it is, and now we want to talk about in workshop how we can be responding or actually managing it. What can we do? And I'm not going to hold you. Some of this sounds like really fluffy self-care, but I think if we can put those things into this lens and this context specifically, right? We might have a newer or a more broad understanding of what it looks like to really address vicarious trauma by taking care of ourselves. So we can split up our responses into proactive responses and responsive responses. That's kind of difficult to say, actually. But what we mean when we say proactive, when we're talking about a proactive way of addressing vicarious trauma, we're talking about challenging vicarious trauma before the worst case scenario, right? Before the thing that happens that could potentially be traumatic happens, right? We want to have some safety nets there, right? This could look like a lot of things that we'll talk about. We'll talk about things like ritual and things we just do to feel good generally on a day-to-day that might actually give us some support and confidence in navigating the really hard work stuff that exists in the secondary trauma space. But also, we might be able to better address that shift in worldview or protect our worldview, right? If we are taking care of ourselves very intentionally because we want to, not necessarily because something bad has happened. Responsive scenarios are what we're doing intentionally and on purpose after the fact, right? When I worked at a large Housing First nonprofit that you've all had trainings from, Pathways to Housing PA, sometimes our participants would pass away, right? And I'm sure folks in this group have had participants in your programs pass away. So one of the things that we were able to do, each as our own individual teams, was decide how we wanted to move through that, how we wanted to create space, make space, take time, take a beat, where we're going to navigate schedules differently, where we're going to go home, where we're going to use time off, right? We might have an obligation to respond when we experience something big and traumatic, right? I have an example. I was part of like a decision to bring somebody onto a pathways team, team 9, our polysubstance use team, which was the team that I was on. And she had come from an organization here in Philadelphia that is very in the weeds in the harm reduction space. They are giving out our safe use supplies. They're providing harm reduction education and resources to the community on a very boots on the ground sort of job. And part of her job was to just scout the neighborhood, the Kensington neighborhood, which I think I've shared before, but if folks aren't familiar, that is what I call the West Coast equivalent of Skid Row. It is another large, like open air drug market. What makes it different than Skid Row is that it's not necessarily like sanctioned or legal to be doing those things there. So there's also a pretty heavy police presence. But this person that I brought onto the team, she would do one or two overdose reversals, maybe a week, right? And what she had to do after those reversals is go about the rest of her day, not knowing if somebody maybe has lived or died, not knowing if she saved them, if she provided like the overdose care and prevention, not care, overdose response correctly, right? So we brought her onto our Pathways team, and I got to observe her work for like a whole week, and then I just wrote her a thank you card. I thanked her for, making the decision to come to our agency, be on our team, and do the work that she did. And I walked past the team room once. We had these big, just giant, like fishbowl sort of team rooms where you could see into them all the time. I saw her reading the card and sobbing. And I'm not gonna lie, I felt really proud of myself, not for making her cry, but like for bringing about some emotion for her. But she had told me that this wasn't something she was used to receiving or doing. She didn't receive any sort of feedback and had a really, really intense job, right? So I will say the onus is on us individually to address things like secondary trauma, vicarious trauma in our own lives, but also the role of our communities to tell us, hey, you need to take a beat, right? You can't be out here doing this all day, every day. You don't know if someone lived or died, or oh, you just found a participant passed away. You probably need to go home because your work is not going to be good. You're not going to be happy with it, right? So yeah, I think about that in an obligation space. There's probably another scenario that I could think of that sounds more like what does it look like to have an obligation to respond when we experience secondary trauma? But I think mostly about that story of just responding to her and saying thank you. That wasn't a response to vicarious trauma. That actually might be challenging vicarious trauma proactively, saying thank you to her, right? Um, but I think the obligation is for us to respond in the ways that we can and stop the work when we absolutely need to. So I'm babbling a little bit. I'm going to take a deep breath and slow down, but noticing and responding directly to experiences of the day to day. You just took a really stressful car ride with a participant. What do you need to do with yourself? Or for yourself, right? A participant just got sick in the car or like went to the bathroom in the car. These are all things that we never expect to experience in the workplace, but do, unfortunately, in the work that we do. Um, so this is a little bit of a distinction between how kind of the categories we can assign to what we're doing for ourselves when it comes to addressing vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. We've covered what the differences are. Secondary trauma is when you start to feel and experience some very similar symptoms as maybe somebody who experiences directly. You're experiencing this as a trauma in your own life. Vicarious trauma is going to be that shift in worldview. Let me check the chat because I said a lot of things that folks maybe have experienced before. You see the most recent, too often the work just goes on in an org, and I think the org has such a huge responsibility to make space. Absolutely, and we have some space in the training later to talk about workplace boundaries. Sometimes we're left with no choice but to take work out of work because we're not supported in the workspace. So the next step there might be learning to advocate for ourselves in our workplace for space. Pathways has a participant memorial, I think annually. I think I've heard that Coalition for the Homeless has something similar before in the past. I think I've heard that. But I think these are examples of what an organization is doing to make space, or like you and your individual teams, if somebody has passed away, what are you all doing together? Can you do anything to support one another and come together and really be intentional rather than trying to rough it up, bootstraps, and go save the world, right? Because we're not going to be very good at it if we're not very well. Care about this topic very much. I think I might leave this slide. I'm actually going to read the rest of these comments. Excuse me. R.C. Weber says that regarding going home after a death, emotional and action-oriented responses to bereavement are opposite ends of a continuum, with each end popularly depicted as a gender-specific stereotype. I wouldn't second guess an individual decision either way. I love this. This is very loaded. There's a lot here, and I'm think I'm gonna like screen grab this. No, I'm not, because I don't know how to use a MacBook, but I'm gonna take a picture of this and it'll probably make its way into our content, right? Because the way that we cope and what feels good is not going to be the same across the board. And I think I see a little bit of that here as well. Some people do appreciate getting back to work. I still think we have an ethical obligation to ourselves and to the folks that we serve to sit and think and breathe about how our work might be impacted by what's happened to us or what we've experienced directly. Um, and also how we respond to trauma or big and scary things is very gendered. I heard somebody on the socials one time say that, boys are socialized not to cry. You might have heard me say this before because I've said it a couple times since then. But boys are socialized not to cry or to be vulnerable. And girls are socialized to be more like men, right? Because men and patriarchy really rule the world, or are part of dominant culture. Maybe that is more clinical kind of terms that we're familiar with and we've used in training sessions. And yeah, I think that also paints a picture of how folks are holding this in different ways, and maybe is worth checking in about. R.C. Weber's comment reminds me of, I responded to a crisis case where an employee at an agency died on site. I was there just for like emotional support, therapeutic support for the folks that were involved, and also for folks that were not involved but still impacted, right? The person that was facilitating all of this, who got me in, got me acquainted, and introduced me to everybody and told me the structure of the day, and we workshopped how it was planned. I didn't know until I was leaving that he was the person to like break down this door because this person was like clearly not well, right? So when I was leaving, time was up, right? And when I learned that, I said, "Oh my God, how are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm fine. These things happen in the world." And I think that he's learned to respond that way, right? This was like a shipping and manufacturing company. This was not a helping agency. It was not a nonprofit agency or anything like that. It was just a regular schmegular workplace, people with 9 to 5s. But that story and little case vignette comes to mind when I hear and read R.C. Weber's comment. And I think that story also holds some value in that, like, we are not the only folks that like experience these things. Vicarious trauma exists also outside of the work. If you're engaged in like empathy of any sort with anybody, you can be vicariously traumatized. Alrighty, I'm gonna move on. We talked about proactive and responsive strategies. So proactive is, what are we doing every day? I, in my own life, have a little journaling practice that I'll actually introduce later to the group. Let me check the time. Yeah. And I would say that is a proactive way of managing some of the things that I might experience later down the road that just don't feel good to me, right? I have this regular practice of being intentional and jotting some things down that do skew maybe more positive. And I'd call that proactive. I'm not doing that in response to just feeling bad. I'm not doing this to like alleviate anything. I'm doing this for the general health and wellness for my brain, my body, and my heart. Proactive might be something like an impromptu grief group, or a critical incident like debriefing with a team that has experienced the death of an employee or a team member or a participant. That's something we're doing after the fact to support folks and moving through something that could potentially be or exist in the secondary trauma space. So I'm going to read these, and I'd love to get folks' engagement. This would be a gift for me and Ryan if we have as many responses as possible in the chat, of just a P or an R. And maybe we'll get one person to talk about why for some of these. Do you think that this is responsive or proactive? I will say that this is likely different for everybody across the board, and there is some context that is probably important in hearing this. So there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. But the goal is to be thinking about how these things fit into our life. Are they proactive strategies? Can we have more proactive strategies? Or do I need to bolster my responsive strategies? Are really hard things happening at work and I just go home and act like it didn't happen and I'm not processing at all? Or what can I be doing instead in response to what's going on in the workplace? So I'm going to read the first one. The first strategy is to examine your daily life for the negative effects of stress, burnout, and vicarious traumatization. What's this look like for folks? A P if that's proactive to you, or an R for responsive. Alrighty. Lauren and Ryan are with the R's here. We've got Kristen saying proactive, Matt and Monique and Tiffany saying responsive. A lot of responsive here. Anybody in the responsive camp want to talk about maybe why this feels responsive and not proactive? This seems to be the winner, or the majority anyway. Why does this feel responsive? You can go ahead and type your response in the chat, but it's after the negative effects have already taken place, where it feels like noticing existing pain. Lauren and Ryan are just on it, and also so poetic, it seems. Responsive because it is in review. Examine your daily life. Yeah, this does give like my initial thought was that this feels proactive to me. I'm thinking about maybe in my history or my work history or professional history, how stress and being burnt out has maybe harmed me or like other people or participants, and maybe what I want to be doing differently. But if I'm just feeling really bad and then examining like the stress and burnout in my life, that's definitely something that is responsive. RC Weber says, if loss is expected in a habit or a procedure set up in advance, proactive could be defensible. Wow. The way you write is so unique, RC. It sounds like I'm reading like legal literature and I'm enjoying it. If loss is expected in a habit or procedure is set up in advance, yes. If we are doing these things on the front end, if we are just reflecting generally, but in a pretty good headspace, this is going to be proactive. If we are examining these things after we're already feeling pretty low and bad, and maybe we need a new job, that's going to be responsive. Thanks for engaging in that. I feel as though it's proactive because it is something I am aware of and I am not wanting to become carried away. Yeah, there's an awareness here, so we're going to do something about it now, right? Awesome. All really valid rationales, like just echoing what Ryan's saying in the chat. I'm going to find some juicy ones. Let's see. Taking your own advice and do the same things for yourself that you would see your clients do. Does this seem proactive or responsive?
Yeah, that would be like if every time you have a session with a client, you're suggesting they do X, Y, and Z breathing exercise, but then you notice you never do that same breathing exercise. So taking your own advice in the intervention is what is what it says here.
It looks like there's some pretty quick P's. I'm in the P camp. Looks like Matt and Laura is as well. Any R's here? Seems like there's fewer responses here. What do other folks think? Does taking your own advice feel proactive or responsive? Kristen, you did it first. And I don't know if your ellipses at the end are like the doom that comes with like maybe being like called out, but I'm wondering if you have anything to share about why that might feel responsive, Kristen. Kristen is iconoclastic. I'd be responsive by realizing that I'm a hypocrite in a mild way, doling out advice, but not willing to take it. So that prompts you to, it sounds like that awareness is prompting you to change something, right? I'm aware of this thing that I'm doing that doesn't feel good to me that I'm doing this, right? And I want to make a change. That does certainly sound responsive. Somebody from the proactive camp, why does this feel like a proactive strategy in managing vicarious trauma? Ryan, can we go back one slide? If you look at these like indented bullet points here. I think this is probably what we need the most in like understanding the concept. Building in healthy habits and care is why I think that this might be something that feels more proactive to me. If I am generally trying to practice what I preach, right? Or walk the walk or walk the talk, whatever these sayings are, right? Then if this is an everyday practice that I'm doing just to like move toward health and something that feels good and in alignment with me. But if I'm taking my own advice after I notice I made a decision that I don't feel good about or had a client interaction I don't feel good about, that might be responsive, right? So again, super valid, whether you exist in the P camp or the R camp, but I do appreciate these examples here. P, to prevent issues in the future. All right, well, maybe take, how many more you think, Ryan? I'm looking at the rest of we're gonna take a few more actually. It's only 12:49. Let's just take the next one. In re-examining one's commitment to one's self-care, start with the basics. What does this feel like to folks? Starting with the basics of self-care after re-examining one's commitment to taking care of yourself. Wow, I don't think Ryan and I have agreed on a single one so far, which I think is really cool.
No, that's not true. That's the only one we've disagreed on so far.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah.
I love making stuff up, by the way. Not in the training space, but just like, relational things. Like, wow, me and Ryan are just at odds all the time. Honestly, a little bit of both. Lauren, do you want to fill us in on why this feels like it exists in both camps for you?
Yeah, while Lauren is typing, I mean, I think what's coming up for me as we're going through this activity, and we knew it would, is that like there's not actually a very clear answer to either of these, to any of these, right? Like these are all going to exist in both proactive and reactive or responsive ways, depending on what is happening in our lives, right? So if I just went through something and then I'm reevaluating my relationship to self care, then it's responsive. If something hasn't happened in my life, it's probably proactive, right? And so I think you all are kind of starting to hone in on that like gray area. But yeah, would love to hear you talk more about that, Lauren, or what your thoughts are.
Lauren says that because it's re-examining, like reflecting, but also proactive, like starting with the basics and building in new habits. Yeah, when I hear re-examining, I think that that is a result of something, right? I'm re-examining this thing because something's not working for me. So I need to get back to the basics. But also just building new habits as a way of like paving like a new road and new possibilities and ways of navigating things like vicarious trauma and burnout, compassion fatigue in our field. To reconstruct your daily schedule, integrate a routine of self-care, proactive strategies that work. This one, oh, I want to read Laura's comment first that says, if re-examination is routine for me, then it's P, it's proactive, but also responsive if some new event has prompted it. Yes, absolutely. And that has actually informed my response to the next one about reconstructing your daily schedule. When you reconstruct your daily schedule, the reason that you're doing it is probably pointing to whether this is something that you're doing for general health and wellness to be proactive. And therapists restructure their schedules pretty often, right? Sometimes because it's necessary, and other times just for health and wellness and to feel more okay with their work. But if I'm completely flustered and I've taken on too many clients, I'm restructuring my schedule because, like, as a response to dealing with whatever's coming up for me as a result of a mismanaged schedule. I won't mess with my schedule unless something isn't working. So Ryan definitely exists in the response camp here. And Kristen agrees. Alrighty, those feel good. Let's move on to a few more. What haven't we said? To be prepared to address vicarious traumatization on an ongoing basis because it's a process, not an event. I am smelling that we all might agree on this one, but we'll see. Yep. Um, Anybody care to maybe expand on why this feels proactive? It seems like folks have responded all agree so far. I think there's some language things here that point to this being proactive, but I wonder if there's anything else that anybody has to share. Maybe around just the concepts. What does being prepared do for us when it comes to managing vicarious trauma? If you think somebody else is typing, maybe assume that they're not, and let us know what you think about what this looks like. Ryan says it speaks to thinking ahead, thinking of what might be around the corner. Yep, that sounds like it is proactive. I'm thinking ahead because I want to maybe prevent or address vicarious trauma or be more aware of vicarious trauma. I do think the idea of like preparing for trauma is a little tricky and complex, but I think could make some sense in the vicarious trauma space specifically. What am I doing to protect my worldview, to protect my values and things I really care about, to protect the reasons I came to the social work field or to the homelessness or substance use setting? What do I need to hang on to? What can I be engaging in to make sure that I always believe that housing is a human right and that doesn't go away for me, regardless of who's at the other side of this table, right? Someone using substances, somebody who is not taking their mental health medications, someone who maybe you've heard has abused somebody in their life. These are all like super complex situations that we have in the social work field and space. What I think we can't necessarily prepare for are those big events, right? So workplace disasters, deaths, things like accidents. These are going to be those single isolated incidents that we typically see or are reading about when we're looking at the criteria for a PTSD diagnosis, right? Those are things that we can't prepare for. We can't prepare for trauma. We are also not always prepared for how we're going to respond to trauma. We can say, I think about this a lot in the grief space when people pass away. I've heard a lot of times people say, you can never prepare to actually lose somebody, right? Even if it is long coming, even if you know what's going to happen, you're never actually prepared. I've heard folks say that a lot. And I think about that in the trauma space as well. We can prepare for worst case scenario the best we can. We can be doomsday preppers all we want, right? But I'll tell you, one day I moved into this apartment. It's a cool little lofted apartment, and I was walking up here to like to see what's up there, like storage and stuff, and I was like, you know what, this might not be a great idea. And then I live here by myself, right? If I fall, no one's here to hear me, see me. My friends have my location, but they're gonna think I'm home and okay and safe, right? That's not something I could prepare for in my life, right? And I think the same parallels the trauma space. All full of stories and case vignettes today, it sounds, but I think being relatable is just helpful. All right, we're gonna move on, Ryan.
Cool. I just wanted to kind of share. I was reading Lauren's comment, maintaining self-care practices so you're prepared. And it made me think of this concept of maybe sort of like self-care calisthenics. If we are not accustomed to actually using our self-care strategies in a time of need, we may be less likely to be able to engage those practices in useful ways, right? And so I kind of like the idea of uh, noticing what it feels like to engage in healthy self-care, even in times where there's not a sort of specific event, um, but we're ready, right? I'll since I'm talking and the mic is open, I'll read some of these other comments. Laura says, I recently read, quote, create a life you don't need to escape from. Interesting. I mean, I so say we all, right? I wish we could. And for me, oh, never mind. I could get too existential here. Kristen says, I agree that we cannot, quote, prepare for things unknown, for the when things happen, but knowing that they could and that they do happen, preparing to be able to accept something holds a lot of power. Yeah. I like that idea too, the acceptance of it, as opposed to maybe an exact response, right? Something negative could occur, and I know I'll be able to handle it as a result of all of these ways that I've tried to prepare. And I think that speaks to the concept that we talked about earlier around vicarious resilience. Okay, I am dropping a link in the chat to kind of just a supplemental document that has these 10 strategies that you see on the screen on a one-pager, something you could print out, post it on your bulletin board, maybe review it, reflect on it. So just repeating some of that content on a one-pager. All right, Khalil, self-care basics.
Okay, this one I think we will move through a little bit. We want to make sure we have a good amount of time for an activity that folks might recognize when we get to the end that we're going to plan to do for about 15 minutes. So self-care basics. Here are the things that you've heard before. And here I want to challenge you all to look at these things and think about, when have you said these to somebody in your life, socially, or to a participant or a client that you work with? When have you said these things? And one of the strategies from that sheet that we shared a couple of slides ago around taking our own advice be applied here when we think about self-care, right? So what is our sleeping like? Are we eating okay? I would just had a conversation with Ryan yesterday about, wow, I really ate like crap this whole week. I'm gonna go to Wingstop because their carrots and celery are really good. Like I feel like I needed vegetables, right? I said that to Ryan, and Ryan's like, why don't you go to the grocery store and get some like chopped veggies? I'm like, you know what? I think you're right. Um, what are we eating and putting into our bodies? What's our breathing like? Do we even know what our breathing is like? So tuning in there, maybe some mindfulness we might say here. Are we moving our bodies? I'm a big fan of recommending and encouraging some form of movement practice. And this doesn't mean you have to be a CrossFit girl, right? This could mean you wake up and you stretch your arms and your legs and you are getting more in your body before you start your day or before you leave your house. Are we taking time off when we need it? Do we have it? I sometimes, when I led an ACT team, sometimes people say, oh, I can't take off on this day because so-and-so needs to go to this appointment and I'm the only one that can do it. No, absolutely not. You're not the only person that can do it. And if that is the case, this is a systems issue, right? It's not a you issue. And like, you take off and it's me and my role's responsibility to figure out what we do about that appointment or that specific case scenario. So taking time off unapologetically because you have it as a benefit of your agency, if you have benefits, not as a luxury, right? They are giving that to you. Use it. Your job is very hard, very taxing and draining, and you do it because you like to do it. So taking time off so that you can still enjoy your job might be essential to taking care of ourselves and taking care of our participants. And then our work and home environments. Somebody taught us a while ago. I've only ever heard the story second or third hand. Ryan might have heard it firsthand. But the idea of your desk, a messy desk, is not a very trauma-informed thing to be presenting to your participants, right? But I also think about what it does to your brain and your body and your heart when you walk into an office or like your workstation, your workspace, and it is a disaster. And then, of course, your home environment. Are you comfy, cozy at home? Something I think I literally said in the last training is something that I talk about with with my clients in the therapy space. Is it's one thing to experience mental health symptoms generally, right? To just be experiencing despair, loneliness, dissociation, depression, and anxiety are probably the bigger ones, right? And it's another thing to do that in your home that is comfy and feels safe and is giving all the vibes that you want it to give, right? So what does my work and home environment say? I know for me, one of the environments that I really am challenged by is my car. My car is a wreck, but it gets me from point A to point B, which could be such a peaceful time, but I'm always like moving over papers and like finding French fries and like old Dunkin' cups in there, right? My friends get in, they're like, hello, what the hell is going on here? Um, But yeah, our work and home environments, or I think just generally our environments, I'd even say probably our social supports as well. Who do we have in our lives to be um, bouncing thoughts and feelings off of and expressing vulnerabilities to is probably something else we might add to this slide here. Um, Examining workplace boundaries is going to be another thing that helps us challenge vicarious trauma, and really all the funky stuff that comes with maybe having a 9 to 5 or something similar. So here are just some good reflection questions that I think because of time, we're not gonna answer. If you are reading any of these and you have initial reactions, I'd love to hear those in the chat. Feel free to fire them off. But maybe just take a picture or a screenshot of these and really be thinking about what these look like for you in your own life in the context of your relationship to your job. How much energy is spent on off-the-job activities and relationships? If you have a role that is on call all the time, maybe that on-call role needs to rotate so that you are not on call all the time, right? If you're at work and researching best practices for, let's say, creating a community advisory board within your agency, full of participants, and then you go home and you're also doing that, you're just working all the time, right? I don't know why community advisory board is the example that came to my mind, but it was. How much time is spent devoted to work? What does our work day look like compared to the other things in our lives that we want to be taking up spaciousness in our brains and time in our days with? I know this is something that people struggle with a lot, right? Sometimes we get up, we go to our jobs, we go home to get ready to go to our jobs again. So it's kind of hard to have any respite before we're back and we return. And this is also a good reflection question. I think just in thinking about vicarious trauma in general, this last one here says, what part of my work role feels the most challenging and how do I deal with this? Are there parts of your job that feel really funky? Is it a communication thing? Is it a team structure thing? Is it a safety thing? And how are we dealing with that? Are we bottling it up and never naming it anywhere? Or do we have specific processes or things we can be doing to address your workplace stressors, right? Because that's the thing. Addressing this is, well, could be proactive or responsive, but if we are re-examining these things, what part of my job feels the most challenging? That's a responsive way of addressing vicarious trauma. What just feels not good about my work role? And that leads us to the next step, and what can I be doing about that? So examining workplace boundaries is another way we can touch the vicarious trauma or address vicarious trauma in our own lives. I do think we have a lot of responsibility for experiencing, for how we navigate vicarious trauma in our own lives and what's coming up for us in the workplace. But there also might be ways that your agency is contributing that aren't helpful in allowing you to manage that in the ways that feel healthy to you. So just some reflection questions for you to examine what's going on in your workplace and how examining these boundaries or maybe setting some new boundaries could be challenging some vicarious or secondary trauma symptoms in the future. There are also these 3 strategies that we appreciate. I'm just going to read them as they are. So one of the things we can do is examine your motivations for going beyond the expectations of your job. If you're someone that goes above and beyond all the time, if you've ever worked in an agency where you have performance evaluations and they say, oh no, you don't get a 5 or you don't get a 4 unless you go above and beyond, and you're like, dang. Don't feel bad. You're not getting paid to go above and beyond, right? I know it's one thing to say and another thing to do and execute. Everyone wants to feel good about themselves. Everyone wants that feedback. But sometimes what we're doing to obtain that feedback just is not sustainable and doesn't feel good and could actually be harmful, not just to you, but also to your participants. So if we find ourselves putting our neck out there more often than not, maybe we're thinking about why. I think that's a great thing to be discussing in the therapy space. I have a handful of clients that identify as recovering people pleasers, they say, right? Who are very consistently doing this, wanting to go above and beyond, wanting to make everybody happy and found themselves feeling really low and like they didn't have anything left for themselves. We can also learn and use effective communication in settings across systems. So how are we engaging with our teams across the board? so that we're all on the same page about our agency's work and what should be happening. And then we also want to recognize that going above and beyond your work boundaries with clients and colleagues can cause harm. I think I maybe said that for each of these, right? That this could actually be damaging, right? But this is just an example of what it could look like, or to help you understand what in your own life, maybe in your own reflection of your agency role, what you might be able to do to put some strategies in place to address workplace boundaries. Looks like the chat is popping off. Kristen says, in the field of mental health and substance use disorders, it oftentimes feels all-encompassing. Being a person in long-term recovery and working in the field, it is personal and professional all the time. So I have to be aware of my boundaries and discern what is personal and what is professional. There's a lot of crossover or bleed through. Yeah, I want to read Ryan's comment because Ryan commented before my brain has worked this out. But Ryan says that what an interesting comment. So tough to figure out these really nuanced boundaries. Interesting to think about how your relationships with substances and mental health changes the further one gets from early recovery. Yeah. Recovery spaces are always evolving, or somebody's recovery experience is always changing and evolving as time goes on. And we continue to pursue recovery. But I think this happens a lot with helping professionals who and harm reductionists as well, I think, and especially therapists who think that they can't have opinions about their friends and loved ones and personal relationships. This is something that I think I've experienced throughout my own life as a therapist and a social worker, is I might find myself responding to people I really love and care about in my life the same way I might respond to a participant or a client in a therapy session. And that might look like not inputting how their behaviors or how their ideas or thoughts and actions are making me feel, right? Because I'm trying to make this space about them. But when you have personal relationships with people, it might be okay to say, hey, this actually is really freaking hurting me, right? Or this didn't feel good to hear. And that can be okay. And you also might be able to be more advice giving, right? When we're thinking about your role outside of a helping professional, you are a human being, right? So I think naming those vulnerabilities and expressing needs being super helpful in just maintaining relationships that feel good, and maybe like you're not working all the time. It's like, actually, I can be sad right now, or actually, I don't have to be on. I don't have to be my best dressed or my most articulate right now. I can just maybe be myself in a specific space. But yeah, a ton of nuance here for sure. Thanks for adding that. I mentioned a journaling activity. This is a journaling activity that I found just in a book at some point, and I've implemented into my own life as often as I can. I would say that this is a proactive strategy for managing vicarious trauma. So the idea is that we are living and working with intention, right? We are living on purpose, and everything that we're doing is intentional, and that we are working on purpose. Our client interactions are intentional and mean something. So I separate this into two camps. We're going to talk about today, and then we're going to think about tomorrow. So in capturing today, we might ask ourselves, what do we do to take care of ourselves? Did anything good happen today? Are we grateful for anything? You can be doubly grateful because that's on here twice, something I'm grateful for, something you're grateful for. I don't know how that happened. And then can we summarize today in one word? What does today feel like? And then imagining tomorrow. Do I have an intention for tomorrow so I don't run into the day floundering? Why is this important to me? And what am I going to do to embody that? I just want to be clear. This is the stereotypical sort of gratitude practice I'm recommending here, right? As a proactive strategy to keeping you well or well enough, or you doing something for yourself, right? This is not something we do when a participant passes away. This is not something we do when a big event occurs or those single isolated incidents happen and we're responding to a crisis. This is just something that might feel good and add something into your life and help you live a little bit on purpose. So just this is an outline that I use, and I think I appreciate, and I share it with clients in my own workspaces as well. But maybe some form of this or some adjustments here might also work for you. We can condense this, we can expand it. But what are you doing in your day-to-day that points to the idea of working and living with intention?
All right. Kind of just continuing the theme of proactive responsiveness to the potential for vicarious trauma. And I love the way Kalo says, sort of living on purpose. Another way that we can do that is to um, use and practice ritual in our life. And so I want to talk a moment about like what ritual is and how, and one way that we can use ritual to um, live on purpose a little bit. So for me, when I think about ritual or the word ritual, it has a connotation of like spirituality or religious expression. I immediately think of like Catholicism and all the ritual around kind of what a mass is and how it looks and the way that the Pope is selected and things like that. You can even think of Muslim practice and the prayer 5 times a day and having the prayer rugs and um, kind of stopping everything that you're doing to attend to this level of spirituality. Those are things that I would call ritual, right? But I would even call something ritual like getting up and drinking coffee by yourself first thing in the morning. You know, taking some quiet moments that way. Performing a very specific bedtime routine. I think we could think of that as ritual. Stretching, you know, before we do our exercise. There's a ritual practice there too, right? Um, so ritual exists in our lives all around us, even though maybe we don't call it that. And I want to talk a little bit about the value that it kind of has for us as human beings. Um, First of which is that it really heightens our involvement in the experiences that we're having, right? When I am getting ready to have an experience or when I'm in the midst of any human experience, if I ritualize it, it heightens my involvement. It heightens how close I am to that experience. And it's a way of living intentionally or practicing intentionally, right? And so it increases all of the sort of good or positive feelings that we get out of that thing that we're doing, right? Um, Another kind of value that it has in our lives is it helps us organize our days and it organizes our blocks of time, right? And so that example of drinking a cup of coffee in the morning, I actually spend a full hour every morning when I can, not every single morning, but most mornings, brewing my coffee, using a French press, letting it cool down while I sort of like scroll things on my phone and sip that coffee for a full hour before the family is awake. It's my quiet time, right? And so it organizes my time. Now I know I'm probably not going to scroll on my phone as much later in the day because I'll be very busy. And if that is valuable time for me, or if like sipping that coffee is valuable time to me, it helps me organize my time, right? Um, it also, we sort of use this as humans to mark significant social events. Even a birthday is an example of a ritual, right? Or if you think of sort of rites of passage, I'm thinking about people sort of aging into adulthood and all the ritual around that. Um, the ritual of birth, of death, right? Funerals are examples of ritual events, right? So we mark significant events and milestones through the use of ritual because, or one of the reasons because, is the way that it heightens our involvement in those experiences, right? Um, and in fact, sorry, RC has a comment here, maybe some extra that they're adding. A funeral is a ceremony, one and done, for the specific uh, deceased, but a ritual repeating for those who probably will attend many before they become deceased, right? A cross-cultural view is that a funeral has at least two sides. It commemorates the deceased, but also drives home the point that society persists even as its constituents change through the usual means of addition and attrition. Yeah, good extra kind of clarifying. It is ritual for the folks that um, continue on in the sense that it's something that exists across time, right? We're going to probably do a similar ritual for all the folks that pass in our lives. But for this one specific moment, we'd call it a ceremony. Yeah, that's a great great addition there. I think the important thing that I wanted to add here about ritual, though, is that ritual has a positive effect on us, even if we don't believe that it will. And there's some interesting studies around like putting into place a ritual around the eating of chocolate, and folks that had eaten chocolate and also participated in this like arbitrary ritual experienced a higher level of satisfaction and joy from eating that chocolate than did the folks that didn't engage in that ritual, right? And so that heightened involvement, that heightened perception, and increase in intentionality increases positive effects, even when we don't think it will. So there's value there. Some of those benefits, again, it adds structure to our lives. It enhances our enjoyment. It allows us to savor experiences. It allows us for that greater sense of control. We talked about that sense of control earlier in the training. That is a specific mitigator around trauma. It can help us reduce our anxiety, right? Think about performers who always, even like athletes that always perform the same kind of ritual prior to engaging in their sport, or musicians that always do the same thing, always kind of tune the same way and set their instrument down and take a deep breath. Whatever their sort of ritual is, it can help to reduce anxiety, and ultimately it can enhance performance. I think it's an interesting thing to think about performance in the helper sense. I wonder if anybody out there has ever felt like they're kind of in a flow state related to helping clients. I think I've experienced this kind of in snippets over time, where I'm just like feeling really good about the help that I'm able to provide and the resources I'm able to share and the way that the cases are going. It doesn't last very long, but there is a bit of a flow state to the helper work that I'd be curious to see if there's any research around that. Anyway, enhanced performance is one kind of aspect of ritual practice. Okay, so all of that to say that the way we leave work, the way we transition from work to home, can be an important way that we reconnect to self, right? And if reconnection to self is one way that we move towards vicarious resilience, then that separation between work and home can be an important component of that. So 3 questions, similar to Khalil's journal questions earlier. Number 1, is there anything that you can do that helps you leave work at work? Or is there anything you do that helps leave work at work? I've got yous and me's in here. Sorry for the language. And so for me, as an example, I would always make sure that I cleaned my desk off before I left work, right? It helps me sort of like put the piles where they need to be and feel a sense of completion before I exit work, right? And that way I'm able to not think about those piles on my desk as much. I probably still did a little bit, but it helps. The second question is, do you allow yourself any transition time between work and home? This is something I've not been very good at, but something I've tried to practice a little bit. Using my bike to get home allowed me for a little bit more flexibility to ride through a park that was a little bit out of the way, right? And spend a little time sitting on a bench for just a few moments before heading to work, right? So building in a very specific buffer between work and home can be part of this ritual practice. Maybe drive through the neighborhood with the really big, beautiful stone homes instead of going the more direct route home. That's a transition period. And then finally, the question, do you have any ritual that you follow at the end of your workday? Again, my language is mixed up between yous and my's. But yeah, any sort of ritual that is not necessarily about the transition, but it's like an ending practice, right? Maybe you like to go say goodbye to that person over in the other department before you go. You don't have to, it's out of your way, but it's a way that you kind of end your workday. Or then even specifically at the end of a workday, but you're at home, how do you close up shop and get yourself ready for the next day, right? Do I pack my breakfast for tomorrow or pack my lunch for tomorrow tonight as a ritual practice? So I think the idea here is you continue to kind of experiment and find something that works for you. Maybe it's watering your plants at the end of each workday or at the end of each week. Maybe it's specifically taking the dog for a walk as soon as you get home as part of your ritual practice. Changing out of your work clothes immediately So whatever it is, I'm just trying to indicate here that there is a real value to ritual, and that we can make this transition part of that ritual practice as a way of increasing our level of satisfaction, control, structure, and ultimately well-being. All right, I've harped on this quite a bit. It's time to move on. So last session, we kind of ended with something that we called the silent witness. And I gave you a link to kind of a whiteboard with sticky notes on it that allowed us to indicate how we might notice vicarious trauma in our own lives. So I want to do a similar activity today, and I've dropped a link to that in the chat. And in this case, what I'd like you to write on a sticky note are any of the ways that, or any of the ideas that you've developed, things that you're thinking about now or already practicing as a way of being proactive or directly responsive to specific trauma in managing vicarious trauma. So I'm asking you to put your good ideas for how to move forward onto a sticky note. If you open this, you don't have to sign in. If you're already signed into Canva because you have an account, you can log out if you'd like for your response to be anonymous. And we'll each get a chance to kind of share in this together and see what other people's ideas are on a sticky note. So I'll go ahead and be quiet. I'll give 5 minutes because we're wrapping up low on time, and then we'll just reflect for a moment. Yeah, and I think you can just double click on any yellow sticky note and it will start allowing you to type.
This seems like a little bit of a hard one. Hey, Ryan, can you hear me?
Yes, I could.
Okay, I could not find my Zoom tab, and I do.
All right. I'm not going to read these out loud, but by sort of being in that link, you can see what some of your colleagues have written. And I just want to invite you to check those out, see the way that other people are engaging with the potential for vicarious resilience. A couple of, thoughts that we have here might be to kind of just reflect on your own experience of what it was like to identify those strategies. Is this something you think about frequently, or is it newer to think about those things? Maybe also consider what did you notice when you're looking at your colleagues' statements? Are you seeing good ideas? Are you seeing different ways of managing and coping? Maybe just consider in an intentional and on purpose way what other thoughts might be coming for you. We won't have time to kind of talk about those things out loud, but just want to kind of point you in the direction of that reflection. Again, to practice living on purpose, living with intention and with ritual, and kind of responding and being proactive about this really hard helping work that we all do. And in that same vein, I just want to say thank you to everybody for the work that you do and for taking the time to be at a training like this where you hope to kind of advance your skills and advance your practice in service of your residents and participants. So that's
Yeah.
it for us. Go ahead, Khalil. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just have a little bit of a gift, like a verbal gift for folks. So I teach, and sometimes I say that I'm an intro, that I teach social work at Eastern University here in Pennsylvania. What folks probably don't know when I say that is like I also went to Eastern University here in Pennsylvania. It's a small Christian college, which makes it hard to be a lot of things that I am and other people are in the communities and people that I care about are there. But there's a pretty significant faith component, and now that I am teaching there, I have to integrate that into my coursework on a pretty regular basis, which is sometimes really challenging to me. But I'd love to leave folks with a pretty secular and non-religious, faith-based benediction that I wrote for this next cohort of social work students that I think is fun and a challenge to helping professionals everywhere. Um, there's like a Lizzo quote in here and some other like fun, quirky things, but is a challenge to you all in your work. So this benediction says that in case nobody's told you today, your work is sacred and so are you. Go in peace to love and serve the least of these, but take your anger with you. I love you. Please leave. That is the benediction I will give to the folks for the rest of the summer semesters. Um, yeah,
Thanks,
That's
Khalil.
awesome.
great to be with you all. Yeah, good to see you all.
Thanks, everybody. Ryan, Khalil, much love, much appreciation.
See you. We'll see you all.
Likewise, right back at you. Bye, everybody. Thanks for being here.